Hi everyone, Kim here with Native Lady Book Warrior, and today I am going to be talking about nonfiction reads that I read in the month of November. So basically this is just like a nonfiction wrap up. So let's get started. Okay, so the first book that I read for Nonfiction November, in total, I believe I read 6 or 7 books. We'll find out. The first book that I read for Nonfiction November is called The Heartbeat of Wounded Knee by David Treuer, and it's Native America from 1890 to the present. So I feel like I talked about this book a lot recently, and I even recommended for a different video, which is nonfiction reads you should check out for the month of November for Readathon, or just basically recommending one for each month of 2022, which is right now. I rated this book 4.5 stars. This book's narrative is pretty diverse. It not only gives a historical account, but also a journalist account. Also, it's part memoir from David Treuer himself, and then his kind of like one-on-one interviews, and then also events that he's taken from his own life. So it's pretty fascinating. I found that this book to be pretty accessible. I suggest, if you all aren't very heavy nonfiction readers, I suggest you just check out the prologue. If you feel like you've become captured by the prologue, it gets so much better than that. This book, it gives a very diverse account of indigenous nations from the time period following the Battle of Wounded Knee to present day. This book successfully demonstrates the resilience and brilliance and the innovativeness of indigenous nations, government, culture, economy, peoples, indigenous knowledge, and then obviously the list goes on and on. But this book also very much speaks on a huge statement that I'm sure you all probably saw during, or that you see a lot within indigenous communities or during November, which is Native nations and Native communities and Native peoples. We are definitely still here. There are also testimonial accounts, and there were some times where I felt like contemporary indigenous storytelling is also mixed within here, and that part is definitely one of my favorite things about this book. So the indigenous nations that Treuer talks about in this book, of course, are very diverse. They span across the United States. But one thing I have to say is that this book, I don't know if any book can possibly talk about every indigenous nation and their experiences, but I will say that the commonalities that indigenous people did experience, especially when it did come to United States colonial oppression, their experiences with US racist policies and law, genocide, and of course land theft. But of course those are going to differ across indigenous communities and nations. So I did have some problems with the book, and one of them were just minor, but I also feel like I have to say something because it does have to do with my own community, not specifically Hopi, but Treuer does talk in here about the Anasazi peoples, and that is not a term that Pueblo communities, which are descendants of ancestral Pueblos, call them, because Anasazi is actually not a good term for our ancestors at that time. And it's also a term not even that derives from Pueblo communities. It actually derives from a larger community or nation, which is the Navajo Nation. I think that's one thing, though, that's one of the things that I had a problem with. I kind of was hoping maybe he would talk about or use the term ancestral Pueblos. The term we have for that specific community is the Hitaktinam. But yeah, that was like, I was gritting my teeth through that part. I also feel like an important reason to read this book is because books like these also unveil this romanticized history that the American public has about indigenous history, or even also about Black history. So I feel like when we're in school, especially public school, we are given these romanticized and even sometimes false narratives of how this country was founded and how it clings to those romanticized, mythic, and even false narratives of Columbus and etc. Those histories also they cover or refuse to acknowledge the systemic violence that has happened and the bloody history of this nation and how it came to be. What I saw within this book is to see these very detrimental systemic shifts happening by era, and how brilliantly and to see Indigenous resilience and intellect and knowledge and culture all across the board respond politically and innovatively to these very sometimes even detrimental shifts that were happening at that time. So yes, check this out. Again, I gave this 4.5 stars, and yep. Okay, I'm gonna close the blinds because there's the sun setting in. It's all in my face. Oh, that's so much better. I was probably like moving all over when I was talking earlier. The next nonfiction read that I got through is A Mind Spread Out on the Ground by Alicia Elliott. And wow, so this book is a collection of essays and also very much part memoir written by Haudenosaunee writer Alicia Elliott. This book is outstanding. It's deeply and a very vulnerable and personal account of intergenerational trauma, race, also sexual assault, colonial oppression, and the different ways that it infiltrates systems and organizations within North America. Also, there's deep exploration of family love, challenges, mental illness, poverty, colonial oppressive mindsets in socio-political systems and their function. So and it's not a very long book, and most of this is not necessarily written as an argument, but definitely based in real life experiences, even of Alicia herself. Wow, goodness, what else? There's a lot packed into this book. Alicia Elliott has a very excellent spectrum of fluidity when it comes to her writing. So her prose was incredible, jumping back and forth between past and present, but also very much melding those parts together. I think she also speaks on much colonial and also socio-political issues that reflect both her personal experiences and then observations of settler colonization of especially of North American society. She also explores those issues and her experiences as not only an Indigenous person, but also a person who has experienced poverty and all of these different levels and complexities. But I saw a lot of connections there, especially when we're dealing with colonial powers like the United States and Canada. There's a lot of parallels there, especially when you're talking about boarding school or the Indian adoption era. I imagine we call them totally different things, but there's almost, even within the same time span, these injustices against Native people were happening around the same time. Another thing about this book is that I really, really loved the writing. Sometimes I would go back to an essay or to a paragraph and just really comment on how that is a perfect way to explain or comment on the unexplainable. A lot of the times when we are especially dealing with oppression or dealing with injustice, it's difficult to name something or name an act that you know is not right, but you struggle with identifying those things. But with this book, Elliott paints a picture around those things, not only in the act itself, but how it's affecting BIPOC communities, how it's affecting people who don't have access to a lot of resources. But more importantly, she does it in a way where she's not info dumping or giving you a lot of incredibly dense information. Instead, those things are grounded in emotions and a lot of experiences and comparisons, and she very easily explores complex topics. This book is extraordinarily accessible. I could see her essay by essay guiding us through her personal experiences of settler colonialism, and yet she is very patient in doing that and compassionate. So the tone of this book isn't angry. It's, to me, it felt almost gentle, and it also felt empowering. I think she does that by just informing you and educating you, and just talking about things that she has gone through. And a lot of those pieces are actually very traumatic experiences, but she is able to connect those things. Like the way that I pictured it when I was reading it was her traumatic experiences being all of these puzzles scattered all over a table. But then the way she connects those traumatic experiences to systemic or injustices or systemic problems that exist, once she flips those pieces over, you immediately are able to identify racism, cultural genocide, sexism, misogyny, and erasure, and especially assimilation. This book, in my opinion, is definitely one of those decolonization reads, because in order for us to understand trauma and violence and all of these things that are happening within society, we have to name those things and connect and recognize what those things are deeply rooted in. And she does a really, really, really great job at that here. A Mind Spread Out on the Ground, and the title of this book is just incredible. I would explain it to you all, but I recommend you find out why it's called this. I mean, you can read reviews, but I would definitely just pick up this book because the way it's written here, it's just amazing. So yes, go read this. Okay, so the third book that I read, wow, I think this next book is also the nonfiction pick for Jess Owen's book club community read, and that book is Hood Feminism: Notes from the Women, A Movement Forgot by Mikki Kendall. This book was really good. It also is not a very long read, and it's by Black author Mikki Kendall. Holy crap. I think one of the awesome things that I did unintentionally was read this after I read A Mind Spread Out on the Ground. I feel like these would make two really excellent companion reads. That's just a suggestion. I mean, you don't have to if you don't want to, but this book is outstanding. It very much takes an excellent look at intersectionality. I mean, not an in-depth look at intersectionality, but I feel like if you haven't engaged in intersectional feminism, this is definitely an intro book. It talks about how intersectionality and its mandated presence in feminism, because I feel like if you are leaving anybody out of feminism, especially the Black community, the Indigenous community, or just basically all of the BIPOC community out, then you aren't being inclusive in a movement. And then in my opinion, it isn't feminism if you're leaving people out of that. When we leave out or we don't prioritize the basic needs, protection, safety, and the voice or voices of an entire community, that is likely because our supposed feminist efforts, like white feminism, are tied to losing power, keeping privilege, or even fearing the loss of control. So during this entire book, I was agreeing with a lot of it and agreeing with Kendall's arguments and points being made, because they are very much backed by real experiences of the Black community and of Black women. Also, the layering of Black oppression, subjugation, and its systemic presence with it in the United States is very much makes its appearance throughout these pages. So this book was a very fast read for me. I couldn't get through it fast enough. I read most of it through the physical book. As you can see, I have flags all over this book, and I took out most of my writings, which is on mini post-it notes, because I ended up copying those to book journals. But what I want to say about this book is definitely a empowering education read, not in any way or form attempting to shame the white community, but instead it takes this approach where it's educating those of privilege. I found this book to be really awesome. I gave it 5 stars. And it's also it's a very accessible read. There's a lot of topics in here that range from domestic violence to even MMIW, GR, which is missing and murdered Indigenous women and relatives. And you all should definitely check it out. Excellent read. The next book that I read is actually another memoir. This book I read, first I tried to read it through audiobook, and I wasn't really grooving with the narrator. So I was like, when I'm trying to do chores or I'm trying to just get things done within the home, I will pick up the audiobook and I'll just go back and forth, or I'll just do a hybrid read. But this next book, I'll put it right here, is called One Native Life, and it's by Richard Wagamese. So if you don't know who Richard Wagamese is, he's actually, unfortunately, no longer with us, but Richard Wagamese is Ojibwe from the Wabansi Hmong independent nations of One Man Lake, Swan Lake, and White Dog. Yeah, so he's, like I stated before, he's no longer with us, but another works that you all might be familiar with is Indian Horse, but One Native Life is, I feel like it's going to be one of those books that I reread. And it's not a very long book. I don't rate memoirs, but this was such an excellent read. It was a very good read. It's very well written, and it is a short book with sometimes even short chapters spanning like 2 to 3 pages. But it really made me think about my relatives and my Indigenous relatives, and how Native people are in some way or form making that healing journey. This story in some parts is spiritual, but not in a way where it's romanticized. It's a very personal account where it almost even feels like meditative, and its prose is very gentle. It's deep. It's very calming. It's not spoken or written in a place of anger, but just almost someone inviting you in and just showing you and talking about their life. In my opinion, and I'm trying to not make this sound romanticized and from an Indigenous perspective, but I felt like this book was one long reflective prayer on Wagamese's experiences, and his truth, exploring what he has gone through, was just incredible and extremely beautiful. His trauma that he talks about within this book doesn't, like I explained, or that I said before, it doesn't come from a place of anger or extreme trauma in your face, but he does recognize that he has come from places of neglect, substance abuse, displacement, and identity issues. But his writing experiences of those things have a very strong sense of peace and seeking of understanding. So I felt like, I don't even feel like this book is written for me, or in a way I felt like he wrote this for himself to reflect on what he has gone through and how far he has come. And it was really incredible to be let into that world. So one of the things I want to explain about this book is it definitely has that tone of coming from a place of being healing focused rather than trauma focused. The subjects that he writes about are all very diverse, like music, friendship, safety, reconnection, parenthood, and even baseball and athletics. So I found those topics that he explores to be also refreshing, and almost refreshers between chapters that were kind of difficult to read about. Or another thing about tone, I feel like there's a lot of humility embedded within these pages, but there's also, I found that his writing to be that he's not out to prove any kind of point or to make any kind of argument. It's just him allowing us intimate glimpses and observations into his life. And I felt very, not only safe in those spaces, but also I felt very honored to be let into those spaces. I don't agree with some of the things that Wagamese does reflect on here, but I don't feel like it's me to say, it's up to me to say those things, because this is a very individual journey of one native. And of course, we're all diverse. We all have our own journeys. But I feel like, of course, when we're talking about the title, this is just one native life out of the experiences of many. And so this is a book that I very much appreciated. There is so much humility and calmness and peace within these pages, and the easiness of the writing and of the feel definitely sucked me in. And it was such a very fast read. I think I read this book within the afternoon, I believe, but very excellent book. I suggest you all check it out if you just want to read a memoir that is not very long and that has a very calm and peaceful tone to it. So, yep, One Native Life by Richard Wagamese. The next nonfiction book I read for Nonfiction November was really awesome. I think I read this at maybe the last week of November, and I got through it so fast. So that book, I'll put it right here. And this book was actually provided to me by Libro FM. So thank you so much for Libro FM for giving me a free copy of this audiobook. And that book is called Bad Fat Black Girl, Notes from a Trapped Feminist by Sesali Bowen. Sesali Bowen is a writer who curates events, writes for film and television. Bowen is also a former senior entertainment editor of Nylon Magazine. So Bowen's writing has appeared in New York Times and also Feministing. This book, wow, it was such a refreshing, powerful read and an absorbing perspective into Sesali Bowen's life, her experiences, while highlighting her love for trap music and what it means to be a trap feminist. And yes, she coined that term. I'm saying right now, this is another book that is a top read for 2021. Not only because the narration is extraordinary, because it's actually narrated by Sesali Bowen herself, but also it gives a very fresh and a very genuine and a very needed perspective of a Black queer woman's experience that is not sugar-coated or edited or redacted in any way. This book, it doesn't exist to make us feel comfortable. What I enjoyed and loved about this book is Bowen's ability to challenge that excellent ideas, writings, lifestyles do not have to meet this or fit into this Western cishet white worldview. And the book identifies and recognizes and lifts up Black experiences, voices, the right for safety, protection, and the challenges that the Black community faces that has been left out of the mainstream feminism. So one of the things within this book that is explored is that trap feminism includes crucial and much needed conversations on race, intersectionality, class, the patriarchy, sex work, body politics, sexuality, and then lastly, solidarity. So there are many sections of this book that had me agreeing. I was nodding my head right along. Sometimes I would simply reflect on my own negative experience that I've experienced with sexist and misogynistic attitudes, especially in my own community with Native cishet men. Also, my experiences with poverty, growing up with a single mom, dealing with racism and bullying in an all-white school. And I realized that a lot of those experiences, for me, sometimes, especially when I read them within books, they feel censored. Or when I read about them, they feel edited in some way. So I really respect Bowen's storytelling and the subjects, the topics, the experiences she writes and narrates on, because they are beautifully and wonderfully unrestrained and phenomenal, and that's what makes them empowering and phenomenally powerful. So this book is definitely one of those reads that blew me away. I feel like this is a read that is not only raw, powerful, honest, even at times vulnerable, but it's also very much full of strength, resilience, and to hear that within the voice and the narration of Sesali Bowen herself and to hear that conviction, force, and that ease that it's expressed in. I listened to this book, I think straight through. I think I'm probably only had maybe a 2-hour break while listening to this book total. I am very much looking forward to Bowen's next book. If she decides to write another book, I'll definitely be there to pick it up. So yes, very excellent read. I suggest you all check it out. All right, so the last book that I read for the month of November, for Nonfiction November, obviously, was Lakota Woman by Mary Crow Dog, or Mary Bravebird, and also with Richard, I think it's Erdoes. I say was because Mary Crow Dog, or Mary Bravebird, is actually no longer with us. She was a Sichanghu Lakota activist and writer, and also a member of AIM, or the American Indian Movement. She was present for some very historic events when it comes to especially contemporary Indigenous history, like the occupation of Wounded Knee, the occupation of the BI headquarters in Washington, D.C., and also the Trail of Broken Treaties. Within this book, she talks about her experiences being Lakota, growing up on the Rosebud Indian Reservation, and also her experiences with a neighboring reservation or nation, which is Pine Ridge Indian Reservation, which at the time was under the leadership of Richard Wilson. Again, I don't rate memoirs, but this book was very educating, and I feel it would probably be very informative for those who don't know a lot about the American Indian movement, or how Indigenous people were treated during the time of a lot of policy going on and a lot of changes going on during the 1970s in Indigenous communities, basically that whole era of oppression against Indigenous peoples. If you want a more personal account or a narrative or an Indigenous perspective of what happened during that time, this could be added onto that pile. I suggest you not only add this, but I'm sure there's plenty of memoirs and also other reads that will add to this experience. During this time, though, especially border town violence wasn't just happening within this nation. It was happening in almost, I imagine, every single Indigenous community across the United States. I mean, me personally, my family has lost people to border town violence, and we have experienced that ourselves. One thing about this book is that I found incredible to read was that I learned about those experiences that were happening around this time of the 1970s in college. And I read this book a while back during that time, and a lot of other reads that talked about what was going on during that time. But when I read about within a history that is full of facts and whatever, those accounts of what was going on, they feel very one-dimensional, not talking about specifically what was happening to Indigenous people, like the personal accounts. It just says border town violence. It doesn't get any more specific than that. Brave Bird's book gives more context to what was going on. It also talks about how culture and spirituality at that time very much fed this movement and how it was important at that time, not just protesting or seeking justice, but it all came from a very cultural and spiritual center. The negatives of this book, it was hard for me to read. It was hard for me to get through. I didn't enjoy the writing very much. And a lot of people I talked to, oh, the grammar is awful. I don't like the grammar. I was like, I had no problem with the grammar. I didn't enjoy the writing. And unfortunately, that interrupted the flow of this book. I also understand that sometimes repetition is important for storytelling, but that kind of repetition wasn't in this book. So sometimes I would hear things that I've heard before, and I don't know if those things were intentional or if maybe the editor didn't catch those things, but that writing, when it came to that, kind of bothered me a little bit. I mean, I just kept on reading through, but I would catch it here and there. So this book isn't spoken of in chronological order, but that's fine. I don't really have a problem with chapters. It doesn't read like from A to B, but I felt like the transitions between chapter to chapter were a little bit rough for me. And another thing that I want to recommend in terms of this book, that this isn't the only account of these events that are out there. I suggest you read more diverse accounts that have happened during this time. I personally know someone who was there during this time. I haven't got this person's permission to ask who they were, but they were very close to this inner circle of people during AIM, and hearing their perspective on things that were going on is very interesting. I feel like that person that I personally know can write a whole book on what was going on during this time. Just like I said, there's other perspectives of what was going on, and just like history, some of those perspectives they conflict, and that's okay, but it's important to kind of see also what other people were seeing and experiencing during this time. Yeah, I didn't really I don't read memoirs, but I didn't enjoy this as much as I did, as I hoped I would. But I definitely recommend you all check this out if you don't really know a lot about the American Indian movement or what was going on during those events that I was talking about, like the occupation of Wounded Knee. So yeah, I read this book for Aaron and Danny's book club called Indigenous Reading Circle. I wasn't able to make the live show for this, but yeah, so thank you, Aaron and Danny, for recommending this book. I've learned a lot, and it was a very interesting read, so thanks. Those are the books that I've read, nonfiction books that I've read for the month of November. If you made it all the way to the end of this video, leave me any kind of cat emoji. So y'all know, like, if you ever see my videos, there's always cats running around in the background. So I shall see you all soon, and I hope you are safe. I hope you are well. I hope you are reading fiercely, and I shall talk to you all later. Bye.